Porcupine Tree, closure continuation, album review, let's chat about it. Hey friends, what's going on? John here from What's Spinning, here tonight to chat about this latest from Porcupine Tree, English prog metal legends. Yes, this review is very late, and modern prog metal is not easy for me to take in, man, but I had some thoughts on this album, and I figured I would share them still. Now, my thoughts on Porcupine Tree are a little all over the place. Their early work, like On the Sunday of Life, never been that into it. I mean, it's far from actually progressive, but ever since, my thoughts on the band have been even more all over the place. Up the downstair, I hated the heavier side of this album, and the chugging riffs were so freaking obnoxious, but the spacier, more psychedelic, more post-rock inspired elements of this album I thought were pretty cool. Something that they dived a lot more into on The Sky Moved Sideways, which I always thought was one of their better releases. Also, not to mention, it's one of the more progressive, actually thought-provoking works in their discography. To make matters even more annoying, I had the exact opposite reaction to their follow-up Signify. The more progressive moments on this album were some of my favorites. Waiting Phase 2, The Sleep of No Dreaming. I thought those tracks were great. It was the spacier elements of this album that actually got more on my nerves. Clearly, my thoughts on this band are all over the place. Like, take for example, Stupid Dream. This was one of their least progressive, more alternative rock-inspired albums, but I always thought it was really likable. But I've never, ever, ever been a fan of Lightbulb Sun. This is to a T where I hate my prog metal. On the other hand, In Absentia is kind of exactly where I want to hear my prog metal. But then I was just right back out of the loop again with Deadwing. I know people loved this thing to death. It just wasn't my cup of tea. It was bloated, it was boring, it was underwritten. But even still to this day, I do like the very freakish and dystopian Fear of a Blank Planet. I was super into that in college too. But by the time that the incident rolled around, I was exhausted with the band. Also, Steven Wilson's solo stuff I've never been that crazy about either. Which brings me to this new album from Porcupine Tree. I wasn't going to cover it originally, but my morbid curiosity kind of got around to me. And the main reason I wanted to chat about this album is it's actually not that bad. I want to get some negatives out of the way first because this album has a lot of positives. Harden as an intro is just not my cup of tea. The thumping bass, the shaky vocals, the ultra clean production, no thank you. I mean, the chorus is actually pretty good, but one track in and I'm already kind of nodding off. I mean, as always, there are some moments where the playing is quite exquisite, especially the drumming. For the most part, that's pretty good throughout this entire album, but for outside of that, this track is just not my prog metal of choice at all, especially the last few minutes that are so boring. Rat's Return is not my cup of tea either. These jagged, complex riffs and these whisper, quiet vocals just blow right past me. This is honestly my nightmare, and in plus 5 minutes, I can't tell you anything about it. On the other hand, Walk the Plank is really hard to put your finger on. It's a very hazy, sort of electronic track. In a way, it almost reminds you of what Steven Wilson was doing on his last solo record. But I don't know. It's a little awkward, truthfully. It's a little full of itself. It's a little too spacey, too, and nothing really stands out or, really impresses me. And that's a shame because I usually love when Porcupine Tree get a little spacey, get a little weird. And Population 3, it's really hard. I mean, the very grandiose start to this track actually was pretty eye-opening. I got my hopes up. But what follows is just solo after solo, riff after riff. It's tough. And some of them are quite impressive, but it's just not a spectacle. It just goes on and on and on. It's the longest 7 minutes here. I think it's the worst track here. The bad parts of this album are certainly here. Surprisingly, though, the album isn't that bad outside of that. Of the New Day is one of the lighter tracks on here, but it's got some fantastic vocal work. It's really beautiful, it takes its time, and it ends up being pretty stunning. When the band really put their minds to it, they could really put together a very serene sort of scene. When things get a little heavier, get a little crunchier, this track becomes really, really even more solid. I do like the riff that we get here quite a bit. Oh, yeah, and it's genuinely progressive. Dignity is one of the best tracks here. It is by all means one of the most epic tracks here. It has a serious sense of majesty to it. It's not one of the heavier tracks here, but it's so easy to get lost in, mostly due to its incredible atmosphere. It also shows them taking a step back, sort of, you know, going back to the roots of post-rock or like the prog rock of the 70s that I grew up on. It also has some of my favorite vocals from Steven Wilson on this entire album. All around, this is great. I don't even mind that it's plus 8 minutes. For a more standard prog metal track, Culling is one of the best here. I love the very tense, very looming bass riff that we get here, as well as these post-apocalyptic lyrics. It creates a hell of an atmosphere, the mysterious synths as well. And it gets pretty heavy, heavier than I usually like hearing them, but nonetheless really compelling. I like Chimera's wreck as well. This track just creeps along, is super mysterious, but it's the little details on this track that really make it memorable for me, like the instrumentals to this entire track. They're some of the more subtle here, but some of the playing is absolutely exquisite. It gives me the chills. This is exactly where I like hearing my prog metal. It takes its time, it really puts its ideas into form, and it has some legitimately daring thoughts as well. Honestly, to my surprise at least, it's some of the longest tracks on this album that blow me away the most. Never Have starts off with some pretty graceful pianos. Not only that, but it's got some really heartfelt vocals once again, and by the time that this track really opens up, it's one of the most beautiful here. This one keeps things progressive, but it brings in their alt-rock influences, keeps things pretty accessible and even catchy. And Love in the Past Tense, while not my favorite track here, is far from a bad finale. It's got these strong mystic vibes that are backed up by these very whimsical synths. And Steven's vocals here, honestly, they're some of the most triumphant. It's really not that bad at all. I mean, I wish it was a little heavier in parts, but this is once again the spacier, more psychedelic post-rock and prog metal that I grew up with. I'm somewhat impressed with this album. And yes, this is certainly still not my wheelhouse. It's not an album that I'm going to return to anytime soon. But for a guy like me, who have never been that big into prog metal outside of a few bands here and there, this is actually not that bad. And yes, when this album is bad, like I was nodding off, it's really rough at points. For a band that has been going around this long and that I'd completely fallen off with, no, this isn't bad at all. You might like it a lot more than me, but most of this is pretty good. I wish I could give it that light 7, but there are some tracks that I could not deal with, and there's so much material here. So for now, I'm feeling a strong 6 on this album, but let me know what you guys think down below. If you liked the video, be sure to give us a like, give us a subscribe, and let me know down below what you would like for me to chat about in the future. And until next time, have a great day, friends.